Hello, my name's David Bruce. Today we're going to answer some of your questions about orchestration. Thanks to all of you on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube and on my Patreon for submitting the questions. A lot of the questions that came through were really about getting started, your first steps writing for orchestra. But let's start with this fun question from Andrew from Pagefire. If you had to write a song with orchestration and heavy metal, example Nightwish, Flesh God, Apocalypse, Diablo Swing Orchestra, etc., how would you do it? Well, I think I would really focus on strings, which can really come quite close to a heavy metal sound, whether it's the low growl and grind of the Rite of Spring, or the fast fireworks of some Vivaldi. Some of Shostakovich's music can get pretty heavy, like, say, the second movement of his 8th string quartet. In fact, here's a translation of the piece onto electric guitars and drums. And you can hear it works really well as metal without changing almost any of the notes. So I don't think it's a surprise that there are a lot of string groups that play metal, most famously the cello quartet Apocalyptica. So yeah, strings would be the way to go, I think. Heavy strings. So let's look now at how to get started with orchestration, and thanks to all of you who asked about this. So there are a couple of famous orchestration books. There's Rimsky-Korsakov's Principles of Orchestration, which is pretty old-fashioned now, but sets out some of the basics pretty well. Berlioz also wrote a pretty hefty treatise on instrumentation, which these days you can check out online. Then there's the Cambridge Guide to Orchestration by Ertugrul Sevsey, which I have to confess I've never read. And then there's Samuel Adler's Study of Orchestration, which is a pretty standard thing to study in universities and has a lot of examples which you can hear on the CD that comes with it. So that's definitely worth a look, but you'll notice that both of these books aren't particularly well thumbed. And that's because the real lessons I've had all come from looking through scores and listening to scores. And these days there are a lot of places you can find full scores online, both of the old masters, but also many contemporary composers. Some publishers like Boosey and Hawkes and Fabers have nice online score browsing facilities, which are a great place to check out how contemporary composers write. And actually here on YouTube there's an increasingly large collection of score videos where you can hear the music and follow along with the score as the piece progresses, which is really convenient. But rather than feeling you have to listen to hundreds and hundreds of scores, just listen to one page of one score, set it on a loop, or just study it for an hour and then listen back to it. And a great exercise to do is to find a score that you can also find a piano version of. You can do this for many of the famous symphonies, say Beethoven or Schubert's Ninth or whatever, and take the piano version and try to do your own orchestration of it. Spend an hour doing that, and if you've got some notation software, type it in and see how it sounds on the MIDI, and then go back to the original. And you'll find you have a really intimate understanding of the passage and the problems it has, and it'll be really interesting to see how Beethoven or Schubert solved the same problem that you faced. It starts to feel almost like you've got really into the mind of the composer, or at least you're working alongside them facing the same challenges. Several people asked about the order you should write things. Should you write at the piano and then orchestrate? Or should you write straight into full score? I think a lot of that depends on the kind of composer you are. So if you're imagining a specific texture on a specific instrument, then you're more likely to want to write straight away for the instrument. Whereas if you're perhaps more traditional, writing melodies and harmonies in a more traditional way, then working at the piano first and then orchestrating it out will work just fine. For me, for the most part, I think the colours of the ensemble are a key aspect of my compositions, so I tend to write the main points of the orchestration down initially. It's true that if you try and write everything straight away, you can get bogged down in the detail, so I prefer not to spend hours on the orchestration detail at this stage. I'll tend to write a sketch that has the key details, but not everything. Choral Matt asks, why are certain instruments transposing ones? Is it just a historical hangover? So yeah, transposing instruments is one of those weird features of writing for orchestra that can be quite puzzling. Why are things set up that way? Here's a page from Brett Pimentel showing some of the different transpositions. So there are different types. You might get a clarinet in B flat where the pitch is written at C but actually sounds at B flat. That's one kind of transposition. And then there's the other kind of the octave transposition. So here on the piccolo, it's written as what's known as C5, where the sounding pitch is C6, an octave higher. So in the case of octave transposition, it's simply to make those things simpler for the player to read without having a ton of ledger lines above or below the stave. With the transpositions of some of those woodwind instruments like the clarinet and the saxophone, it has a lot to do with the fact that they're part of a family of instruments, and it means that the player only has to learn one set of fingerings and they can play all of the range of different instruments. So for example, the clarinet, you might get a B flat or an A clarinet. You get piccolo clarinets in E flat and D, or a bass clarinet in B flat. And what you think of as C is the same on all of those different instruments. And that saves you having to learn an entire new set of fingerings for each one. So most of the transpositions are to make things easier for the player. When you're composing and trying to write for these instruments, it definitely makes things harder and more confusing. If you look at most of the 19th century scores, you'll find them written transposed as the player would read it. So if you want to work out what notes are in a chord in terms of orchestration, you'll have to transpose the clarinet part down a tone, the horn part down a fifth, to work out what the notes are actually being played, which obviously makes it quite a bit more challenging. In the past 50 years or so, composers have tended to head towards what's called a score in C, so all the instruments are written at sounding pitch, with the exception of those octave transposing instruments. But even today, there's no consistency in approach, so I've always preferred the score in C, but my publisher Bill Hollab prefers the transposed score, so he tends to ask me to transpose them. The other aspect behind woodwind notation is that the easiest scales, the ones with no sharps or flats, are usually the easiest and most intuitive to play just by lifting a finger off to play the next note. So flutes, oboes, saxophones and the upper register of the clarinet will all play a C scale with the simplest fingering. So you can see that this makes sense when you're learning initially that the easiest scales have the simplest, most intuitive fingering. When it comes to brass instruments, it's not quite so clear why things ended up being the way they are, and it's even more confusing. So the typical orchestral trumpet in the US will be in C, whereas in Britain, and I believe Russia and maybe a few other places, it will be a transposing B-flat instrument. Although in both cases the trumpet player will be familiar with transposing it up or down a tone, so you don't have to worry too much about it. For the trombone, what feels like the home key with the slide closed is a B-flat, but the trombone's not a transposing instrument. So the easiest scale on the trombone is the B-flat, and that's for historical reasons that aren't entirely clear. And don't even get me started on the euphonium, which has different systems in different places, some in the treble clef, some in the bass clef, some transposing, some not. There doesn't seem to be a standardised way of doing it. I've seen various confusing and conflicting theories about how it all ended up like this. Certain traditions seem to have taken hold, for example, in the military, and not always for a fully logical reason. But then once they've taken hold, it's just easier to continue than to change. So for composers, it can be a little confusing when you're in a rehearsal and you're trying to check if someone's playing the right pitch. It's particularly hard to remember which direction things move in. The way I remember it is to think of the instrument's name, so let's say clarinet in B-flat, and then you just say to yourself the phrase C a C, play a B-flat. So when the player plays what they think of as a C, the sounding pitch will be B-flat, a major second lower. The one slight extra confusion to add in is that we also need to know the direction. For the most part, the one you'll play is the one just next door to it, but for the alto saxophone, for example, which is in E-flat, C a C, play an E-flat, but it's not the E-flat above now, it's the E-flat, a major sixth below that it plays. So quite a bit lower than it looks on the page. The French horn can also get a bit confusing. It's a horn in F. So C a C, play an F, but which one? The one above or the one below? Well, it's the one below. Sam21 asks, why is Ravel a great orchestrator and how did he orchestrate so well? So Ravel is often thought of as one of the best orchestrators because everything has this precision and clarity. There's never anything superfluous. There's certainly a lot to learn from him, and I'd like to do a video about his orchestration. But do bear in mind that the wow factor is only one part of the equation. To me, the best orchestration is the one that achieves the goal of the piece the best. So there are plenty of composers who manage to get what they need out of the orchestra to get the kind of piece that they wanted to make. So maybe Sibelius or Beethoven or even Brahms, who has traditionally been viewed as a not particularly great orchestrator. But to me, all three of these do things that bring out the emotional power and beauty of a piece of music that's being played by an orchestra. So what more can you really ask from your orchestration? I suppose it's just worth remembering that being impressed by the technical brilliance of something is not the same as feeling a deep emotional engagement with it. Gus Larea 7 asks, what do you think of Andrew Norman's Sustain about its orchestration? So if you don't know him, Andrew Norman is definitely a composer worth checking out. Over the past few years, his profile's really skyrocketed, and these days you can find him commissioned by leading orchestras like the Berlin Phil and the LA Phil. He usually writes these fairly zany pieces that feel a bit cartoon-like, with ideas barging each other out of the way all over the place. I talked a bit about his piece Spiral, which I thought was very effective on my video on spirals. In terms of orchestration, I'm generally very excited to browse an Andrew Norman's score, as he has such a great way of integrating all the weird noises instruments can make in ways that make complete sense. So they're always a reminder to me that you can stretch what you think an instrument or a player is capable of to quite an extreme degree. Sustain is a slightly new direction for him in that, for the most part, it contains these quite slow-moving harmonies, which remind me a little bit of Thomas Addis's recent slow music. I guess these kind of textures have their origins in works of the 60s and 70s by people like Ligeti and Xenakis, but they come across here really beautiful and emotional. Unfortunately, Andrew's scores are published through Schott and aren't currently available online. In fact, the study score for his piece Play, which won the Groymeyer Award, costs $150, so that's pretty steep. Dr. Spitvalve asks, how can someone use low brass more effectively? It seems like a lot of developing composers use the low brass section for loud, raucous and commanding, and very rarely anything else. Bass trombone and tuba are especially typecast. I have to admit I do fall into this typecasting approach a little bit. I'm not necessarily the best person to write low bass melodies generally, perhaps because my music tends to be quite upbeat and positive, so it tends to be difficult to make that kind of atmosphere using the low instruments as the main line, unless you're maybe going for some kind of comedy effect. So I do, I'm afraid, love a good loud low brass sound. One of my favourites, for example, is the noise you get from the low staccato trombone. This sort of raw energy, which I think is a really unique kind of sound. I also love low sustained notes on the French horn, which can actually go incredibly deep, like 2.5 octaves below middle C. If you want a good comparison between deep horn notes with deep tuba notes, here's a passage from George Benjamin's Sudden Time. So he uses 4 deep horns and then contrasts them with 1 tuba. It's a really interesting difference in tone. There's something more menacing about the French horns. They have this really growly tone, and yet the tuba itself is so self-confident in this note that makes it stronger in this context, almost more terrifying. Tuba generally has a fantastic ability to cut through an orchestral texture. It can be an impressive solo sound. So who writes well for bass instruments generally? Well, I've spoken to string bass players who often mention Mahler as one of their favourites. His bass lines will often have a real part. The motives in Mahler get thrown around the orchestra, and the basses often get their turn, so that's always very satisfying to the players. Ian McAndrew asks, how do you feel about groups reorchestrating your music? My feeling is that if they don't have the resources to perform a piece as I or the composer intended, it's better not to have it performed at all. Or do you think it's more important to get your piece performed even if it's not how you intended? So I had an interesting case of this a while back in regard to my piece Gumboots, which is originally for clarinet and string quartet. I came across a performance which was actually broadcast on Dutch TV, and the performance had no clarinet. The clarinet part had been transferred to the violin, and some of the inner string parts had been omitted, and they'd also added a groovy percussion part. Now, I'm not 100% clear on the legality of such things. I believe it's the case that when you want to cover an existing piece, you can get a license, but I'm not sure if this one would count as a cover. If you know more about this, do let me know in the comments. It certainly feels wrong for it to be advertised as David Bruce's Gumboots, as if that's the thing I'd written. Surely it should at least say David Bruce's Gumboots arranged by X. I guess again it comes down to the kind of composer you are. If you rely on colour the way I do in a lot of my music, it feels slightly abusive for someone to go and change that colour completely. Bruno Pontecorvo asks, in one of your videos you said that violins playing together have a different sound than a single violin. Does the same concept apply to other instruments? This is actually a really fun topic. In the original video I said that just putting 2 solo violins together can be quite dangerous because it can be quite hard for them to play exactly in tune. and there's something about the tone colour of 2 violins that it sounds quite painful if it's not precisely in tune. But as soon as you get 3 or more, then the sound starts to blend and you get the sound of the orchestral strings. With other instruments, this isn't really an issue in the same way. Most instruments will just sound slightly louder, slightly richer version of a single instrument when you play 2 of them. One quite fun exception is the clarinet. It's quite a subtle effect, but quite noticeable when you have 2 clarinets playing together, particularly higher in the register. There's a kind of phasing effect which happens, which can sound quite crude or vulgar, which I think is the effect that several composers who've used it have gone after. So here's a passage in Mahler's 4th Symphony, for example. And you can also hear it quite a lot in one of my favourite pieces, Janácek's highly eccentric nursery rhyme pieces, Rikadla. And again, I think it's designed to give you this kind of folky, slightly out-of-tune resonance. George and Tafos asks, do you believe that electronic instruments will be used as part of the orchestra more in the future? So when I was a student, our professor talked about a piece which had added a particular electronic effect to the orchestra. The teacher said he thought this was a bit of an extravagance. He said, you've got all the sounds of the orchestra, why did you have to go to the extra indulgence of adding this effect? And I have to say I completely disagree with this attitude. It's an attitude which confirms the orchestra as the museum piece I really don't think it should be. Most of the instruments in the orchestra have remained unchanged now for 100 years or more. And I think that's a real shame. You know, I love going into music shops, those ones where you have huge collections of instruments. They're like a candy store to me. But an orchestra is even better because you not only have the instruments, but you have the professional musicians who can actually play them. But I do think that the potential for the orchestra to be even more exciting than it currently is really huge if it was able to adapt and become much less set. You know, if it became something where you could end up with, say, 5 accordions or a row of saxophones or any number of other variations. The composer and conductor Pierre Boulez spent much of his life trying to push for what we think of as the orchestra to become a much more flexible institution that could adapt to the needs of each piece. As he pointed out, in Bach's day, the model was much less fixed. Even, say, the Brandenburg concertos are all written for different ensembles. The orchestra as we know it today gradually took shape over the 19th century and eventually became pretty much fixed. And even though there have been some moves to change it, it's remained stubbornly stuck in its current form. Boulez himself tried quite a lot. He set up institutions like IRCAM and the Ensemble Intercontemporain, which, amongst other things, did pioneer the use of electronics with live instruments. But even towards the end of his career, Boulez was lamenting that things hadn't managed to change as much as he'd hoped. In 30 or 40 years, we haven't gone very far, he said. One of the most radical places today in this regard is the LA Philharmonic, who recently had a 100th anniversary season with 50 new commissions. And they really seem to be attempting to steer the orchestra into a place where new music is at the heart of what they do. And currently they seem to be bringing the audience along with them. And inevitably, if you start doing more new pieces, you'll start to change the makeup of the orchestra and things like electronics will become more possible. Now clearly it would be massively exciting if something like LA became the norm in the orchestral world. But at the moment LA is pretty unique because it's extremely well funded. That 100th season apparently had a budget of $125 million, so it's not currently something every orchestra can do. In terms of electronics, the composer Mason Bates is worth mentioning as a rather clever way of adding electronics quite simply into an orchestral setting. So Mason's written a lot of pieces for orchestra that include a part for himself that he usually plays on laptop, which apart from anything else is a great way to make yourself part of the gig. And Mason's currently one of the most performed classical composers in the US, so something's working there. For me personally, although I'm very interested in electronic sounds, my way of expressing myself really seems to be tied in with the physicality of playing instruments, so it's never been something I've felt comfortable mixing in with my acoustic writing. Mixing live electronics or even amplified sounds in with an acoustic orchestral sound is something that's really difficult to get right. Too often it just comes across as, I don't know, the equivalent of mixing watercolours and oil paints or something. Richard Friedman asks, choice of orchestration may be a limiting factor for getting a piece performed. Do you really need an alto heckelphone here? Should that symphony be better scored for a string quartet if you expect to get it performed? Ever think of those things when you're composing? Yes, the smaller the group and the more common the group, the more likely you are to be able to get performances. Finding that balance between something that you're passionate about that may end up being difficult to perform versus something more standard that's more easy to put on is something you have to just be aware of. I've tended to zigzag between the two extremes, so I do like having pieces that are potentially playable as part of the repertoire of existing standard lineups. But then part of why I write music is to find certain sounds and ideas that I've got in my head, many of which might involve more unusual combinations. So yeah, writing for orchestra can be very exciting. I can only imagine how much more exciting it would be if it became that more flexible institution that Boulez dreamed of. I'm happy to say that in a few weeks' time we'll have another go at the 5 Composers 1 Theme project, which this time will involve a full orchestra. And several of the composers will be writing for orchestra for the first time, so there's sure to be a lot to learn there, so stay tuned for that. Thanks so much to my patrons on Patreon for supporting the channel. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter, and if you enjoyed the video, do please like, subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.